Hi team, Rob here from the Better SMB. Hey, in this episode we have been lucky enough to sit down with one of our biggest cheerleaders, someone who has listened to every Better SMB episode, and who can say that, apart from me who edits the series. We talked to John Hutchinson, business coach based in the Hawke's Bay. John shares many of his insights and wisdom in his years in the police force, and I didn't even know that, as a business owner and now advisor. We talk about the good, bad, and ugly. It is all discussed across this session. This is a great opportunity to learn from someone who is at the top of their game. Now, just before the episode begins, just a quick reminder about our show sponsors, SetSeed, the all-in-one platform builders. Go to setseed.com to discover all the cool stuff that they do. And also visit the Better SMB website to discover Perform IQ. Now, this is our own tool that helps SMBs track their performance and provides insights on where you can build a better business. That's what we're all about. And finally, if you can remember at the end of this episode, please hit the follow, the like buttons, whatever you have to press, share with friends and colleagues. This supports us to continue the work that we do. Anyway, that's way too much for me at the moment. On with the podcast.
Welcome back to the Better SMB, where we're on a mission to lift New Zealand's productivity by helping small and medium business leaders take practical steps to improve their business performance, starting today. I'm David Altena.
And I'm Rob Bull.
We've created this platform to spark a movement. Our BHAG is to get 100,000 businesses, that includes 15,000 manufacturers, on a journey of continuous improvement. Through the podcast, our monthly column, The Last Word, a New Zealand manufacturer, and our growing community, we're building a trusted voice for SMB leaders, offering the inspiration, insight, and implementation support they need to build high-performing, future-ready businesses. Here's a question for every business owner listening. When did you last spend a full hour working on your business instead of in it? For most of us, the honest answer is uncomfortable. And that's exactly where today's conversation starts with our guest. But first, a quick introduction. Before our guest ever advised a business owner, before strategy sessions and governance conversations, his working life revolved around decisions where the consequences were immediate, and sometimes life and death. For nearly 2 decades, he worked in environments where clarity mattered, accountability was not negotiable, and mistakes weren't measured in lost profit, but in real human cost. He learned to spot patterns, ask better questions, and make decisions under pressure, because not making a decision was often the worst option of all. That chapter of his career was spent in the New Zealand police force, where he worked in the CIB and organised and serious crime. And while most people would see that world as completely removed from business, the skills it demanded turned out to be surprisingly relevant. When he later moved into business ownership, running and operating multiple companies himself, he found that many SME owners were facing a different kind of risk, not physical danger, but businesses slowly being eroded by busyness, lack of structure, poor accountability, and decisions that were never quite made. That experience ultimately led him into business consultancy, where for the past 15 plus years, he's focused on helping SME owners build businesses that are stronger, more resilient, and far more valuable, not just busy. Today, through his work at Plan AConsulting, he helps business owners step out of the chaos of day-to-day operations and start building businesses that can actually scale, perform, and endure. We're pleased to welcome to the Better SMB, John Hutchinson, or as most people know him, Hutch.
Cheers for that. I've never actually thought about my previous background and how that has a link to business. So that's quite interesting, just listening to you go through that.
This is your life, Hutchie.
I'll wait for the photographs to come out.
Yeah.
So, John, you've been running your own businesses since 1998.
Last century.
And yeah. Well, I was going to start with last century, but I thought that would make us all feel a lot older than we are. But what made you make that switch? What was the moment or realization that pushed you, firstly, I guess, from the police force and into business ownership, and then secondly, out of just business ownership into actually consulting back to small businesses?
I think if I go right back to my policing days, I enjoyed my time with the police. Definitely learn a lot of things, you see a lot of things and do a lot of things that a lot of people wouldn't be exposed to. I spent a good part of my career in the CIB, criminal investigation branch, and then a lot of serious crime, and probably the last 2 years involved in an undercover program where I was what was known as the operator. So working covertly, not really working with the local police, but having an involvement. And I just got to the stage, a year operationally in the field and then a year in court for numerous court cases. And I just found I was becoming one of those cynical buggers that no one wanted to work with. And I don't know if people were seeing that in me, but I was seeing that in myself. So, and I remember a couple of incidences, one morning going to work, and there was a cordon not far from the police station, and there were some people being held hostage in a bar and restaurant. The cleaners, offenders had come in and were still there. And my first thought was not like, oh, this is going to be an interesting day, but oh man, there goes the rest of my day. And I was just losing the enthusiasm. So didn't know what to do, applied for a job and got turned down. Couldn't believe that. And had a mate that owned some gas stations, and it seemed to be, he was doing okay. And then it's that law of attraction, isn't it? Because when I started looking around, a couple of gas stations came on the market. So did the numbers with the accountant. So you've got to remember, give me a homicide, serious crime in my element, do that, standing in the corner, no problem. But starting to think about business and think about cash flow and margin and balance sheet and P&L, well, I knew none of that. Anyway, so ended up buying, I think it was about the 10th of December. We settled on the first business. I was fortunate that I had a chap, Byron, who was the manager there. He stayed on, and that was really good because without him, I would have been completely lost. And so without knowing what I was doing, 6 weeks later, an opportunity came up and we bought our second business as well. And Byron, one was in Hastings and one was in Napier, and Byron moved across to that. So I guess, in your introduction, you did talk about policing. You're used to making decisions and taking information and assessing information, and that's never worried me. But that was how I went from policing initially into business. And then I had an aha moment probably, 2 or 3 years into business. I'm never scared of hard work, but if you're a business owner and you've got to do stock takes at the end of the year, you can probably relate to this. I was at work counting pies. How many mince and cheese pies do we have? And I remember I had a young lady working for me. She was a really good sort, but was always just coming up and just asking, how do I do this and how do I do that? And I thought, man, there's got to be a better way. Everyone's coming to me with their problems, and my personality, I suppose, is to try and fix stuff. At that stage, I realised I needed to make some changes in my business. And again, back then, there was no, not that I was aware of, there was no business advisory support. The accountants were there to, complete your end of year and give financial advice, but there was nothing really to sort of help you build your business, develop your business. So I took myself on a bit of a self-improvement journey and started reading books and listening to audio tapes. Would you believe audio tapes? Not CDs, but audio tapes. And got to the stage that I decided that I was going to bring an operations manager in place. And what that was going to allow me to do was sort of step back from the day-to-day and have a bit more control on the business, focus on the key areas of profitability and just do the things that I was not getting a chance to do. Unfortunately, I didn't do a very good job to start with around that. And the first 2 people I employed as operations managers, it didn't really work, and that wasn't a reflection on them, that was more a reflection on me. And I think I was so pleased there was someone to pick up the telephone, someone to deal with the staff, not coming to work or the issues. I abdicated responsibility as opposed to delegating responsibility. And it wasn't until the third person, who was a team leader with me at the time, stepped into that role, and we gelled pretty well. And we had a completely different way of doing things with each other, but we were very centered on the direction we wanted to take the business. And then a few years down the track, we bought a third site in Napier as well. And that was fine, but I decided I wanted to do something else. And this was around the mid-2000, well, probably 2004 to 2005. I can't remember exactly when. And we started getting involved in a little bit of property. The property market was quite strong back then. And I stepped back from the day-to-day side of the business. So became an operations manager, ran the whole shebang overall. We had site managers at each of the sites. He and I talked daily. I was starting to implement without actually knowing about it, almost like an advisory structure. So we would have weekly catch up with key items. We'd have monthly check-ins with financials and risks and just that sort of stuff. And that allowed me to sort of step back from the day to day. And then, of course, I remember I don't know if you chaps remember the GFC in 2008, but I sure do. It's interesting because sometimes when I'm talking to business owners now and I talk about the GFC, they just look at me with a blank look as if to say, what are you talking about? But we were involved in property. The GFC came along and it was like a stab to the heart, really. And so I had no intention. My business is called Plan AConsulting. It's around strategy and direction and forward thinking. I had none of that. I had no intention to be working in that business advisory space whatsoever. But I knew that I didn't really have the passion to get back into the gas stations in the way that I did. And then I don't know how I got my first consulting or advisory client. I can't even recall who it was, but that was either word of mouth or an accountant that I knew might have tapped me on the shoulder. I'm not sure. And I actually found I quite enjoyed it. And then that led to someone else, and then someone else would, give me a call. And my business has just been built on word of mouth referral. And before I knew it, I was starting to develop a business advisory program, and it was really cool. And then got out of the gas stations, I think 2017 perhaps, and I've just been working solely in that advisory space since then. Have been on my own until the last year, and in the last year we've launched our Plan A Business Builder program. That's run by or led by Ray, who lives in Papamoa. And I've known Ray for 20 odd years. We were both in the police together, although we didn't work together, we knew each other. And it's been really good. I've enjoyed having someone else to bounce ideas off, someone to test my thinking and say why we're doing that. And so that's where we are now. So never intended to get to this position, never had a plan to get there, but this is where I've arrived and I'm really enjoying it.
Do you think in some ways you're kind of taking the structure and the hierarchy that you had in the police and almost somewhat unconsciously retrofitting that into your service station business to bring people in to do the work and so forth?
I don't.
Yeah,
I think
I find that interesting.
Yeah, I think policing is around structure. There's no doubt about that. But you say it's around structure, but when you're working, especially when you're working general duties or frontline, you don't know what's going to happen one moment from the next. So although there's structure, there's constant change. I think my personality style is, and I've done various disc profiles and psychometric testing over time, and I have a high level of detail, but then there's also, I can't remember the different terms, but a high level of entrepreneurship, and it's sort of I'm a bit all over the place. But I think the structure from the police probably helped me collate my thinking, but it was more picking up books and reading books and being exposed to business. And there were no webinars back in the day. There wasn't even the internet back in the day. Go to courses, and it was really just understanding that I needed to do things differently. I've read a lot of autobiographies from people in business as well to start with. So policing probably gave me the structure, but I moved on from that fairly quickly.
You've spent 15 years in the space. You don't really remember your first client.
I don't.
So you probably had, but you probably had maybe somewhere close to hundreds of engagements with small businesses. So looking back at that, what are the patterns or commonalities that you see? Are there 2 or 3 common mistakes that business owners make that you see just coming up time and time again, regardless of the industry?
Yeah, I'm not actually sure. I've never looked to see how many businesses I've interacted with. Most of the folks I work with tend to stick around for quite a while. I haven't done it recently, but I did it a couple of years ago. I think the average tenure was 7 to 8 years or something like that someone would work with me. So it's not like I'm doing a tranche of work and then moving on to the next one. I'm trying to build long-term relationships to really understand their business. And I've done volunteer work with Business Mentors NZ for probably close to 15 years as well and stuff for the chamber. And I think if I think about all the businesses, and it doesn't matter whether it's maybe an owner-led SMB with 2 or 3 staff, or even a solopreneur, or maybe a business with a headcount of 100, the challenges are normally the same. And I see these themes are quite constant. And Rob, I'm sure you'd see this in your lean world as well. But for a lot of people, they're good at being busy and good at doing stuff. And I can definitely relate to that because that's how I was. Lack of clarity, I think, is always something. Why? Not quite sure why we do something. Have more ideas than they've got time to go and execute, because business owners, I suppose, by the fact they've gone out and got into business themselves, are quite entrepreneurial. And so sometimes they're just chasing their tail. Aren't always across the key information. I'm not surprised, but I'm surprised sometimes when I meet businesses that have been around for 2 or 3 years that they don't really have a good grasp of their numbers. And that's not a reflection on them, because that was probably how I was for the first 2 or 3 years. And that's constant across any business, really. And so my role, I guess, when I'm looking at their business is not to try and turn them upside down, but just help them understand what are they doing, why are they doing it, and then more importantly, what do they need to do to get the result they want.
So the busyness piece, why do you think it's so hard for business owners to break out of that?
We do stuff, don't we? If you have a business, if you go there at 7 o'clock in the morning and go home at 5 o'clock, there's stuff to do. There's always someone calling on your demand. If you've got staff, there's always people wanting things. If you've got customers and suppliers, there's always people wanting answers and information from you. So I think that is just the life of being in business. And it depends if you're being busy and productive or just being busy for busy's sake. And I know that, the three of us, we've chatted around productivity and what that means for SMBs in New Zealand. But I think a lot of the times, and if I think about my early stages, I was simply busy because I didn't know any better. I'd be going to work probably at 7:30 in the morning, going home, I don't know, 5, 6 o'clock perhaps. I was taking work home, but I never did. Just sat in a briefcase and I took it back to work the next day, because I didn't actually know what the alternative was. And there was no one to model myself off. There was no one really to look at. And so you just do what you know.
So I've just reread a book, and we'll talk about books a little bit later, but by Cal Newport, which is Slow Productivity. So if you ever catch up with that, do dive into it. But he coined the term pseudo productivity. So it is around people feeling the need to be busy and being seen to be busy, but actually not achieving too much. And that came out of lack of structure, lack of systems, and also really defining and communicating with the team their expectations. So without that, yeah, exactly what you described. Oh, I'm a business owner, so I must take work home. But you go home and is it really that necessary? Is it urgent? Is it a priority? Probably, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, pseudo productivity is a really interesting concept to really dig into.
I remember I went on a course when it would be within the first 6 months, maybe I'd been in business, I'm not sure. And the facilitator had us, it was up in Auckland, facilitator had us go outside and just sit under a tree for 20 or 30 minutes and just think. And I found that so difficult to do, because, and there were no devices back in the day, but even just to stop and have time to think for a start. And when I first went into business, I had young kids as well. So that's another compounding thing. Plus my wife is a nurse, so she was working shift work. So we're having to juggle that as well. And I think you're right, Rob. I think it's just that we think being busy is a badge of honor. Whereas I used to tell people, when I was trying to transition from running everything to having Kim being the operations manager, I said, I really want to try and be the laziest person in the room. And that doesn't mean that I don't want to be involved and I don't want to be committed and I don't want to know what's going on, but I don't have the need to do absolutely everything. And that is a challenge. And Rob, that goes to one of your earlier points about the business owners letting go sometimes, that they think they need to control and do everything. And that's probably how I was. But actually trusting in your team, trusting in what they can do, being prepared to tolerate some mistakes because mistakes are going to happen, and let go. But if you don't, you're going to be like me on stock take, counting pies, wondering why things aren't improving.
Or let them do it their way. Might not be your way, but it is a way, and it's still legitimate.
I was quite used to that from a policing perspective because staff working with me back in the day, policing, and they would do things differently than I would do it. That was just how it was. And I didn't mind that as long as the result we got the same result, and their method might be different than my method, that's fine. And it was the same in business, but I think in business it's a little bit different too, because it's your money that's on the line. You make a mistake, you learn very quickly in business by making mistakes and making what I call donations to the market. And that's a pretty good learning experience. Whereas if you're just working a job, and probably not policing, because policing, if you made a mistake, there was normally a consequence somewhere. But when you're in business and you make a donation to the market, you get something wrong, you got to do some rework, customer's not happy, there's got to be a refund, the wrong product's ordered, whatever it is, you soon learn from that. And I think that's one of the things that's helped me from my advisory perspective, because when I'm chatting with people, it's not just around theory or what I've read in a book, because most of the mistakes or the things that they're doing, I've probably done myself previously. And you just learn, and learning like that works really well.
It's really interesting because you talk about the mistakes you were making, but then at the same time, you fairly quickly in the service stations were bringing people in from an operations perspective to sit under you, to run things, to free you up. Of course, then you've mentioned getting hiring right. So you're bringing people on so they're aligned with you get on and that sort of thing. So it's almost like you were practicing what you're now preaching without realizing.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I was learning. That was a great period of learning for me, because and even that word aligned that you mentioned. So the first two people that I had in that operations role, it didn't go well. And as I said earlier, I don't think it was because of them, but I probably hadn't been clear on what my expectations were. And I just let them go and do stuff, and then there'd been no checks and balances. Whereas Kim, who was the final person that came on as my operations manager, we were very aligned. But even with him, I had a saying which was trust but validate. So we had, we were doing stock takes on a regular basis. There were things that we needed to do. There was preventative maintenance that we needed to make sure happened and all that. And so we had check sheets and all that sort of stuff, but I would always ask for proof. Probably putting my old police hat on, but I think trust but validate's really good. But Kim was of the same ilk as well. So we sort of tried to get that through the rest of the team that, hey, this isn't holding a big stick over you, but if we've got systems and structures in place, then we don't have to do as much thinking as we normally do. And if we don't have to do as much thinking, but we still do the right things, that's taken the pressure off us. I didn't know any of that at the time, but that's the very stuff when I'm working with business owners now that I'm talking about. So it was really me, I guess, earning my bootstraps in the early days of being self-employed. And then I think that has been one of the things that's helped me connect with the business owners that I do work with.
Well, it's letting your business move at the speed of trust, because as you've mentioned, you bring people on, you make sure they're aligned. Then you've got to give them enough rope to be able to demonstrate their capability, competence, and trustworthiness, and then you can extend that rope, right? And now your business can move faster.
It's easy. You're right, and that is easy to say in principle, but when it's your business and the mistakes are going to cost you some money. Like I was chatting with a business owner earlier this week. They make a product and had been speaking to one of his chaps around the QA side of the product, and it hadn't gone as according to plan as it should have done. Now, that's a direct cost to the business. There's going to be some rework there. There's going to be some cost of materials. There's going to be some unchargeable hours. It hurts. So when you're the business owner, as much as I wanted to let people do their thing, I probably was micromanaging to a certain degree because I was aware of the consequence of getting it wrong as well. And especially in the fuel industry, I don't know what it's like now, but we were working on pretty slim margins back in the day. So it only took, something to go wrong, and then there's a whole lot of gross profit that you're just not going to bank.
Absolutely. But then, it's a sliding scale. So the sliding scale piece I want to touch on, with this idea around the tension between spending time planning versus having no plan and just executing.
Yep.
Or spending too much time planning and not executing. Talk about that. How do you sort of see, we all talk about build the plan and then execute the plan. But what do you see people getting wrong when they're doing that?
I suppose the first question is always, do they need a plan? When I first went into business, I didn't have a plan. I had no idea. I just rocked up and opened the doors and hoped that people would come in. So that was my plan. But that's not really plan. That's just hope, isn't it? When I talk about planning, and strategy a lot, but I always talk about it alongside execution, because I don't think we can have one without the other. I'm sure we've all done it ourselves. Well, I know I have. You set a plan, you have all these fantastic ideas, you can see it in your head, and then you don't execute it, and it's just a waste of time. And I see that with business owners as well, that they'll, a business plan to me could be on one page, and it doesn't need to be 50 pages for the bank or for the franchisor or something like that. If you've got to produce those, then that's fine. But really, your strategic objectives and your business plan could be on one page. And I've got an A3 document that I use with folks that we can capture all that key information in one space. So if you have a whole lot of planning without execution, to me, that's just a waste of time. It might make you feel good and you think you're achieving something, but it's probably not contributing to the GP. And then the other side to that, though, is if you do a whole lot of activity and you do a whole lot of stuff and you're busy, is that actually moving you in the direction you want to go? So I just like to keep it really simple. And I think if you've got good strategy, and we can talk on that later if you want to, but strategy is not a plan or a vision. Strategy is a set of integrated choices. If you have good strategy, if you're then clear on your 12-month objectives, and if you execute really well and manage risk, you've got a strong business. And so it's understanding how all those pieces come together. But remember, that's what I say now. When I first went into business, I knew none of that. I just rocked up and hoped that people would come in the door and we could make some money.
You were getting close to a subject that a common connection of ours, Peter Crow, talks on there with the G word. Yeah. So governance tends to, for many business owners, make their eyes glaze over. And Peter actually did a really good job when we had him on talking through what governance can look like. And, it's not necessarily something for big corporates and massive boards of directors that you need and that sort of thing. But how do you explain that governance to a 15-person manufacturing business or a family-run services operation? How are you getting into its relevance?
I think it depends on the business, and we've got to be careful in business because sometimes we throw these words around without actually knowing what they might mean. Or if I said, what is strategy, the three of us could have three completely different answers and all three would be right. So we need to be mindful at times, I think, that, when we talk about terms, that we're clear on what the language is. To me, governance is just around, I guess, direction, oversight and accountability. Now, that might be at a board level, and a board is just simply directors. It might be at a senior leadership team level. It might be you as the individual sole owner of your business just wanting to take a step back and think about things. So I think governance is around that. Now, we can talk about how governance relates to a business at more of a structural position. So if there's multiple directors and shareholders in a business, the requirements that they might have for governance will be completely different than if I owned the local lawn mowing business and it's just me. Yep, governance will be me sitting down with a cup of coffee, having to think about how things are going. But I think it's the same with strategy and governance, because our eyes tend to glaze over because we don't understand what that means, or we think it's going to be really, really complicated. If I think about the larger organisations that I work with, so someone I was chatting with today, they've got a head count of about 30 people, I believe. Turnover will be about 17 million this year. The owner's looking to step back. They've brought in a general manager. They've got a target to go to 20 million. They're both in New Zealand and Australia. There's a whole lot of moving parts to the business. We've formed an advisory board structure. So the director is still the director and he is the decision maker and he is the sole director for the business. But the advisory board is just really there to support, to offer ideas, to give other ways of thinking. And that's governance. That's direction, that's oversight, that's accountability. But it's no different, as I say, to a person might be a builder with one apprentice. Well, they don't need, a governance oversight like that. But good business is always about stepping back and asking yourself, am I doing the right things? What am I doing?
So if we move that the other way, what do you see when it comes to poor accountability in businesses that you're starting to work with? What's that look like in practice? And what's the cost of it when owners don't see that?
I think that goes back to your busyness comment before, because accountability is really just about getting stuff done, isn't it? I like to train in the morning. I get up early, I like to have a coffee, have a quick read, and then do some training. So the way that I hold myself accountable is that I use an app called Strava. It's not on Strava, it never happened. I ride on an online cycling platform called Zwift. so I can put in what my target mileage is for the week. And by looking at those metrics myself, that holds me to account. And so how do I make sure that I train when I need to train? Well, at night time, I get my gear out and put it in the room that I'm going to get changed into. So I try and remove as many barriers as I can. And it's the same with business. I think at times we put these subconscious barriers in front of us, not quite knowing what we should or we shouldn't do. And because of that, we just flounder. And you mentioned Peter Crow. I think his description was something like a corkscrew in a washing machine, or a cork in a washing machine, or something like that. And I thought that was such a good description. I had to go back and listen to it a couple of times. And for a lot of business owners, that's how it is. They're just doing stuff because there's always stuff to do. But of course, we all have the same amount of finite time in our week. So the stuff that you're doing, let's do the stuff that's going to increase profitability, increase margin, increase long-term value in our business. And to do that versus being that cork in the washing machine, there's not many degrees of separation, but the results can be huge.
So there'll be business owners out there listening to this and thinking, that sounds like me.
That was me.
Yeah. What's the single most important thing they should be looking to do now?
Maybe do what I said before, which is just take a moment to stop and think about their business. And thinking is so underrated, and it is so darn hard to do as well. And I'm not talking about sitting down with a device and scrolling and doing stuff and looking at stuff. I'm talking about just sitting down and thinking, why am I doing this? And this goes back to the integrated choices when it comes to strategy. And the first question is always, well, what's the winning aspiration? You know, if we were chatting in 3 to 5 years and life was really, really good in your business, what does that look like? And so it's probably, even if they haven't done anything, it's just ask themselves that question. Because what that does is that then leads into the next question and the next question, and then everything has this cascading effect. And all of a sudden you go from having absolutely no idea to starting to have a bit of a direction of travel. And then when you've got a direction of travel, you start to get better outcomes, and then you get better financial results. So everything sort of flows into it. So I think if someone was sitting there listening thinking, my goodness, I'm that bloody cork in a washing machine, not quite sure what to do or where to start, I would say just very simply go and sit yourself under a tree and just have a think about what does good look like in your business. And for some people, that sounds a bit woo-woo, you know, like, ooh, that's too new age for me. But otherwise, we just fall into this trap of being busy and just doing whatever comes along. And if you do that, nothing's going to change. What is it? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing and hoping you're going to get a different result.
Yeah, and maybe even as part of that reflection aspect, there's do I want to be doing this? That people can do as well, right? Because I think it's very important. Our businesses in New Zealand tend to be we're just busy making things happen and continuing and so on and so on. And we don't take the time to actually step back and reflect and go, well, why do I want to go this way? What's important for me? For a lot of people, they might actually go, I don't actually want to do this anymore. That could be just as good a decision as any, right?
I think, if I think about over the years, I've worked with probably, I'd say 4 to 5 people that have gone into liquidation for various reasons. And for a lot of them, and it's not a position you want to be in, and you see the anguish that people go through and the pain and the hurt that it causes, and it's just not a good place. But everyone has always said to me the same thing. Once they've decided to do that, the relief has just immensely appeared, and it's like this weight's lifted off their shoulders. And I think you're right. It's just being clear on what you want. And, you know, why would you want to be in a business that is all consuming if you're not making money? And it's not uncommon that I'll meet people in business and they're unprofitable and they're bleeding cash. Well, is that a good position to be in? Because you can only be unprofitable for so long. You can only have more cash going out than you've got coming in, and soon you're not going to have a business. But for a lot of owner-led businesses, that's how they operate, because they don't know anything else, and then they get into difficulties. They miss a couple of payments to their creditors, or they might miss a lease payment, or they think they'll just hold back on paying some GST or PLIE, and you start to get into the spiral. So I think move away from the doing and do more about the thinking and the deciding. That would be my words of advice if someone was feeling a little bit strung out at the moment.
Let's get into some myth busting. What's the biggest myth out there in your mind about running a successful business in New Zealand?
Man, I've got no idea. I think sometimes you don't know what sits behind the layers of the onion, would be my first comment when I hear something like that. Never judge yourself. What do they say? Envy is the thief of joy. So I think we need to be careful that we don't compare ourselves against the person that's got the big flash house and the big flash car, but probably a whole lot of debt that you haven't got. So I'm always a little bit cautious about that. I like what you're doing through the Better SMB and, how you're trying to work on productivity, create information and dashboards for people and build rivalry with the industry. I think that's fantastic. But I always think to people, if you're comparing yourself, and I'm a little bit hesitant on benchmarking, because benchmarking sometimes can be a measure of mediocrity. And because benchmarking is what everybody is doing. But my question, why would you want your business to be like everyone else? Why can't we be better? Yeah, definitely we can learn information from benchmarking and, see where industry trends are, but we need to be careful that we don't sort of, just follow the pack and do that. So I don't know, myths I see on YouTube and LinkedIn, there's lots of gurus out there telling you that there's all these hacks that you can do and you can make $1 million overnight. It's normally some spotty teenager in their parents' basement telling you that. I'm yet to find any hacks or anything. All the business owners that I know work darn hard, are quite clear about what they are doing and get the results they deserve. So I don't know. There's probably a whole lot of myths, but it's not something I've really thought of. What do you think? What do you see, Rob, when you're talking to people? What are they saying myth-wise?
I think the myth is that this is the mistake, that they're the experts and so they need to be the expert on everything, and that goes back to your lessons learned early on in your petrol station career, and that they've got to be the fountain of all knowledge. That, to me, and that comes back to systems, processes, bringing on that expectation of your teams and staff members, exactly what you've been talking about for the whole episode, really. I think that's the myth, is that they've got to be the fountain of all knowledge.
I remember reading a quote from Henry Ford, or I'll attribute to him, and I might not get the quote 100% right, but it was something along the lines, if you're the smartest person on your team's in trouble. And that's something that's always resonated with me. So, yep, you want to feel that you know what's going on, but I really want to surround myself with people that know a lot more than I do, and that can help me work towards the outcome I'm looking to. So you're probably right there. And so for people like that, then it's very hard to let go. And if it's hard to let go in business, then your business doesn't have the ability to scale. And if it doesn't have the ability to scale, you're not building that future maintainable earnings. So when a purchaser comes to buy the business, it's attractive and it has a more attractive multiplier than if everything just relies on you. I think you're right. It's trying to bring all those pieces together. But of course, we don't have to go to a school of business to open a business. We just have an idea and register a company and away we go. And so for a lot of people, and this was me included, if you don't know another way, then you just keep doing the same thing.
Brings us back to the insanity comment, right?
Yeah, and that is life to a degree as well, isn't it? If you eat fast food every day, you wonder why you're not shedding the kilos. Business isn't complicated. I always say to people, you've got to get the work in, you've got to get the work done, and you've got to get the money in. If we keep it nice and simple like that and just think about those core principles, everything else sort of follows through. But business is about good habits and good discipline. And I think if you have disciplined thought, if you have disciplined people, so disciplined thought means, you're thinking about what you need to do, but it's not just you doing the thinking. If you have disciplined people who are bringing good ideas to the table, who execute really well, and if you have, disciplined execution, then you have a high-performing business. And the difference between a high-performing business and a business that's going broke sometimes is not a great difference.
So what you've just gone through there touches on probably your business builder program, I think. And, when we look at that and you talk about how you support businesses to go from, under that $1 million revenue to 5.5 mil or more. And a key bit of that is the leader actually getting this mindset shift. So what do you see with business owners who break through versus those who stay stuck?
I think there is the business owners that break through and scale, and I'm thinking about folks that I work with now that I've worked with for a number of years, they have a pretty clear direction where they're heading. And that goes to my earlier comments around strategy and what is strategy, and then at an execution perspective. So I think they have a pretty clear direction where they're going. They're prepared to do different things. There's an American author, Tom Peters, yes, it is Tom Peters, and he's got a saying, and it's whoever tries the most wins. And I think that is a good example of good business owners. They're not scared to try something and get it wrong. Whereas, we have this thing, and it's an education thing, maybe, I'm not quite sure, that if we do something, we make a mistake, it's frowned upon. But the good business owners that I see are prepared to give things a crack. And it's not always going to work, and they're prepared to let their team do things, and it's not always going to work. So there's a degree of risk there, whereas the people that tend to get stuck are just doing the same old, delivering their core service. And you talk about the E-myth, Rob, it's that technician role, just doing the job. And because they're doing that and not thinking about what it is they could be doing, they don't have any change. So the businesses that hit the sweet spot, I think, are clear on direction, they execute really well, they manage risk well, they know their numbers well, and they just get out and do stuff.
So there was an English guy, Sir Ken Robinson. I don't know if you've ever come across his TED Talk, and because you talked about, you dropped the little word education. I've hung around a few educators in my life and came across him, and his TED Talk talks about how we really train creativity as young kids in schools and, young people growing up. We encourage that, and that, I think, is that trial and error as well, to do, try different things, be creative in ideas, give it a go, and we celebrate the learnings from things that don't go as well. But we untrain that as adults. And it's really fascinating. And when you step back and you think, my gosh, he's right.
So why is that, do you think?
It's just conditioning. That I think it's the same as you, that it becomes frowned on or shameful or whatever if you've tried something and it's failed. Like, I know for our business, we've put programs out there and it's tumbleweeds, nothing's picked up, and that's fine. We thought we had a great idea, put it out to market, and it didn't quite work. So you have to take that as a real learning and then keep going, keep trying, and keep adapting.
I think the market always tells you if an idea is good. I remember just before COVID and post-COVID, I was doing some work for the Hawke's Bay Chamber of Commerce, running what they call their co-starter program, which was aimed at startup businesses, literally, or people that had a business idea. And so there was all sorts of different ideas in the room, and people would quite often say, hey, do you think my idea's got legs? Is it going to be any good? And my simple answer was, it doesn't matter what I think. What do your customers think? Have you actually gone out and done some customer research? Have you talked to people? And if they're giving you feedback and saying, no, that doesn't really appeal to me, then there's probably something in that. And it's the same with pricing. Pricing is one of those things in businesses that can have a huge impact on margin and profitability. And people are sometimes hesitant to change their pricing structure or increase pricing, or I don't like the word discounting, because discounting to me is a slippery path to nowhere. But the market will always tell you if your price is too high or not, or if your price is too low. I work with a number of trade businesses, and there's a particular chap here who's the CE for a large company that I work with. And he said this years ago, and it's always stuck with me. He said, you always want to be second when it comes to tenders. We don't want to be first all the time, because if we're first all the time, then we're probably missing something or not getting it right. And we don't want to be last all the time, because if we're last all the time, we're just not going to get the work in. And so it is that thinking piece. And there's a guy by the name of Bryce Hoffman. He's written a book called Red Team Thinking. And it's that very stuff, Rob, which is just saying, let's try and unshackle the preconceived ideas we have, and let's just think about problems in a slightly different perspective, so we don't have all those biases that we have. And that goes, Dave, to your point about how some people break through. I think it's because they're prepared to make those change or have a go and see what happens. And if that doesn't work so well, they're not too worried about it.
Yeah, well, the people who break through, I guess, are those who are learning and adapting from the experience versus those who are continuing to do what they do and aren't getting ahead, are getting buried, ultimately, right?
I love slow cooked barbecue. So I had no idea when I first started slow cooked barbecue how to do anything, but I watched a lot of YouTube videos. So I thought my first bit of brisket that I cooked should come out absolutely perfect. Unfortunately, it was probably a little bit tastier than some shoe leather, but not much. And so I've been barbecuing for 5 or 6 years now, and I reckon I can turn out some pretty good brisket and ribs and all that sort of stuff. But it's simply by doing stuff, and you're right, learning, adapting, trying something different, not looking for the big change. And I actually think if I wasn't a business advisor, my goodness, the temptation to go and open a barbecue joint would be something pretty exciting. So there's something that someone probably didn't know about me. But it's trial and error, isn't it? You're always learning. You're always trying to do something else. You're always trying to adapt. And it's the people that do really, really well and that find the sweet spot that I work with, I find there's no big silver bullet. It's just one small notch of the flywheel every time. But that momentum builds over time. And when they step back, and I always get people to reflect on where they're at and what their business is doing, quite often it's amazing to think, where the business has come from over a period of time to where it is now. There's no one big thing. It's just lots of those small improvements all the time.
So last thing for me, and then Rob's got a few things for you to cover off, and I don't think we had the brisket piece there. So Rob, I stole one of your questions, so you might have to come up with something quickly. Give me 3 things a business leader who's thinking about bringing in outside help should look for, whether it's a consultant, mentor, or advisor.
I think the first thing would be clear on why they want to do that. Because just because someone says it's a good idea or they think it's a good idea, why do they want to do that? That would be my first thought. I do think experience, I do consider I've got business experience simply because I've been in business for a long time. And the same with Ray, who leads our Business Builder program. He's owned a number of traditional businesses over the years that they've built up and sold. Their last e-commerce business, they built it to a 7-figure turnover before they sold it. So he's got good practical experience. So I think when you're working with someone, you want to know that they've probably walked where you're walking. Now, I work a lot across a whole lot of different industries, and so I know nothing about tech or manufacturing, or I probably know one end of a hammer from another, but that's about it. But I work with a lot of trade companies. So I think they don't need to be the subject expert. The business owner is the subject expert. I see my role as really asking a lot of questions. And then there's got to be a relationship, there's got to be a fit. And sometimes you'll work with people and the fit is really good, and other times the fit isn't there. And if the fit isn't there, the relationship doesn't normally last too long, because when I'm working with someone, it's not just a dash in and dash out. I'm really trying to understand them and understand their business. You see what works for them, you see what doesn't work. When they're under cash flow pressure, you're seeing the consequences of that. So there's got to be some empathy as well. I think the business owner's got to be prepared to have someone challenge their thinking, and it goes to your comment earlier that if they think they're the big dog and don't want to listen to anyone, then it's probably not going to work either. And be open. Both parties need to be open. The business owner needs to be open to feedback, and me as an advisor, I'm always learning, so I need to be open to a new way of doing things as well. So I think if someone was looking at engaging with somebody, it would be, why do they want to do that? Is this person a good fit for my business? And what can they bring to the business that possibly I can't bring myself?
I like it. Back to you in the studio, Rob.
Absolutely right, Hutch. There are 3 quick fire questions, so relatively short, couple of words or a sentence or whatever.
You've just listened to me for the last wee while talk. Do you think I can have a short answer?
Yeah. No, you will. Okay. What is one question every SMB owner should ask themselves at the end of every week?
Have I achieved what I started out to achieve?
Which means that they've got to have a plan for the week, which is great. What is your favourite, you've talked about reading, so what is your favourite, most impactful book that you would always recommend for an SMB owner? Give us a couple of titles.
Yeah, I can't just choose one. If I think about the ones that made the difference for me, and look, I'm still reading now, I've got Rory Sutherland's Alchemy in front of me. So the first book I read, I think, was, and you mentioned it before, The E-Myth Revisited by Gerber. And it really resonated with me. Sarah the pie maker, she's the technician, the entrepreneur, and the manager. And that, I think, helped me start to build the structure that you were talking about earlier on, Dave, with my gas stations. And I really did try and implement that whole process. So that was a really important book. Then Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I read that early on, and it took me a couple of goes to read that because my mind wasn't perhaps in the right place, which sounds strange for reading the book, but I really enjoyed that book. All of Jim Collins's books, Good, Great by Choice, Built to Last, How the Mighty Fall, Vern Harnish, Scaling Up, Owen Eastwood, Belonging, Bryce Hoffman, who I mentioned before. I read a couple of his last year, which was the Red Team Thinking one, which is really good. And then he wrote another one called American Icon, which was about Alan Mulcahy, who was at Boeing, who got poached by Ford pre-GFC to come and turn the Ford Motor Company around. And you'd think, how would that be relative to small to medium businesses in New Zealand? But just good, solid business practices. And then 2 books that I use for frameworks when I'm working with people. So the one I use around strategy is called Plan to Win. And that's by Roger Martin and A.G. Lafley. And that is those 5 integrated strategy questions I talked about. And then the other series is the Blue Ocean, Red Ocean series. Gosh, that wasn't a very short answer, was it, mate? Sorry about that.
That's all right. That's right. And I will recommend, I think I'm right on this one, go onto your website and you do have your bibliography book recommendations on your website. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did that a few years ago now, and I haven't updated it. But
no, it's great.
I got rid of a whole lot of the physical books that I had, but I created that simply by getting the books out of the cupboard and making a list. So, I enjoy reading. I find that when I read, I think, and when I think, then I can find solutions.
Brilliant. Now, the last one, and it's not a one for business, but getting our tourism sector going, because you live in a wonderful place in New Zealand. I've lived there for 10 years, Hawke's Bay. What is one hidden gem of Hawke's Bay that you would recommend to a visitor?
That is so hard because there is so much. I reckon if I would say sit under a tree on a beach and just look out at the sea.
Brilliant. Excellent. That's me.
So I've got a question, and we'll just leave it as a floating question. So given you worked undercover, John.
Well, so I wasn't undercover. I was what was called the operator. So I ran the agent, ran the operation. Wasn't
Right.
A police officer as you would think a police officer was, but I wasn't actually the one directly in the scene, just to be clear on that.
You were the handler, not the talent. We'll go with that.
Correct.
Right, because I was going to ask if you were working under a pseudonym now and all that sort of thing. Maybe you're in like agent protection. Not sure. Anyway.
So here's something interesting. Just before I went into, it was probably before I went into business, obviously. So I was working in the Wellington Drug Squad and Serious Crime Squad, and we moved to the South Island to run an undercover operation. My cover, and so the local police didn't know we were there, my cover was that I was a business advisor. How's that? And so when we rented the house that we lived in, when we did all the bits and pieces, that was my cover, that I was a business advisor. Who was to know that many, many years later that would be true?
Maybe there's a rebrand to Undercover Consulting coming up. Thank you, John. This has been pretty interesting, going back to your car university with your tapes, this idea of continuous learning, continuous development, adapting and changing to what's happening, comment about making donations to the market. A lot of people will be able to relate to that. So, this has been a really practical conversation. That's a word that sums you up really well, right? It's not theoretical or academic. It's proven thinking and things that will actually work. So it leads me to this idea that the thing holding a lot of our businesses back isn't their lack of talent or effort. It's the absence of the right structure, having the right conversations, and then the discipline to step back and go, how are we doing? Where are we going? Rather than just sit in it and go, how the hell did we end up here? Thank you very much for being on the Better SMB and the work you're doing with Kiwi businesses to help them reach their potential.
I appreciate that, and big ups to you lads for the podcast, because I've listened to all the podcasts now probably. If this sort of thing was in business when I first went into business, the learnings perhaps wouldn't have been as difficult. So well done for what you're doing and the journey that you're on to try and lift productivity across SMBs. You've had a great range of speakers. I think you're doing some really great stuff. So well done for that, and keep on doing the hard mahi there as well.
Thanks. Appreciate it.